Welcome, Vanakkam, Swagatham. This is the English version of the Gospel message or the Sunday morning meditation posted earlier on this YouTube fellowship. The overall theme or the title is Jesus and the Prosperity Gospel. Jesus and the Prosperity Gospel. And this message, this sermon, is aimed at providing some clarity, which is badly needed in a context where a lot of confusion has been spread deliberately in order to further the most ungodly activity imaginable that goes on under the aegis, under the auspices of the prosperity gospel. Unfortunately, Christians remain vague and confused, and therefore serious damage, serious harm is being daily done to the kingdom of God. And it's impossible to maintain silence in this context. I attempt simply to carry out my responsibility to provide some clarity on the crucial issues involved here. Hence the title, Jesus and the Prosperity Gospel. What's the connection, if any, between the two? And what is the disjunction between the two? All of us recall, for example, that Jesus said, as found in the 24th verse of the 16th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up the cross, and follow me." And this, of course, also takes us back to the Old Testament, the second book, the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verse 17, where the last commandment is that we shall not covet. Thou shalt not covet. So while the Old Testament commands that covetousness be eliminated, Jesus exhorts, Jesus prescribes as the minimum eligibility requirement to be his followers that they should deny themselves. For all practical purposes, the self is the sum total of our desires. I'm not saying that this is a final or comprehensive or even satisfactory definition of the self. The self is much more than that. But in the context in which we are living and by dint of the way we are living, we ourselves have reduced the scope of our life. Call it not life but existence, the scope of our mere existence, as a sum total of our desires or our covetousness. It does not have to be like that, but that's what it has come to be. And because that's a condition, this covetousness rules our attitude to everything in life, including attitude to God, attitude to religion, and therefore attitude also to God-men. While overcoming covetousness is the basic precondition, the sine qua non, the basic precondition for beginning our spiritual life and growing towards maturity in it, the way we practice religion, the reason we practice religion at all, is that we are driven entirely by covetousness. And this religiosity, therefore, necessarily degrades God into a tool to subserve our covetousness. And it is this state of spiritual weakness, spiritual anemia, and spiritual confusion that these predators who are out to exploit the people of God by spreading superstitions in them, and superstitions are always related to human covetousness. The best way to understand superstition is that superstitions address the covetousness in human nature, and everybody wants unmerited blessings. And the only way unmerited blessings can be even thought of as possible to be realized is by way of superstition. If you do this, if you do that, you can please God. This ritual, that ritual, this offering, that offering. You will succeed in keeping God well humored, and therefore God might give you unmerited advantages and blessings. This is a the very essence of the motive force of superstitions. So, whichever you look at it, basically we hit the same point, namely human covetousness. Now, both the Old Testament and the New Testament therefore recognize that unless and until we recognize the danger that covetousness presents to human life, particularly the huge hindrance it forms in the way of human spiritual growth, we cannot really understand the terrible disservice that's done to humankind in the form of the prosperity gospel. It is it does violence to the English language to call it gospel. Gospel means good news. Should we call the prosperity bad news, or the prosperity devilish news, or the satanic news? It cannot be the good news at all. So let's now understand why covetousness is such a huge spiritual problem. Secondly, what is it that we can do about it? So very simple, two things. What's the harm? What's the spiritual peril or danger that covetousness holds out to humankind? Second point of inquiry, what can we do about it? Now, covetousness stands in the way of our growth, our development, uh, that is to say, developing that which is godly in us. Covetous may result in the development of material prosperity. I have no doubt, and I don't want to debate that assumption. But covetousness certainly subverts, not only minimizes, it subverts our spiritual growth and and our duty to develop the godly dimension in us. Therefore, you will see that the more materialistic a culture becomes, the more ungodly people are, which is also quite evident from the various patterns of behavioral aberration that come to light from time to time. So, now, the uh, basic problem in covetousness is that it deflects us from the path of attaining the or fulfilling the divine potential in us, and it takes us to the narrower goals of seeking material gains and prioritizing material pleasures, all of which prove to be a pitfall in due course. And that's why Jesus said there are two ways, the broad way and the narrow way. The broad way is the way of covetousness, and it seems very attractive. The prospects seem very good, and therefore you walk merrily along the broad way, but it ends up in utter disaster. Whereas those who take the narrow and straight path, which is a path of overcoming desires, overcoming greed and covetousness, and attaining a greater degree of identity with the nature of God, and that enhances your life, and the final result is incredibly desirable, incredibly beautiful. So this contrast Jesus very clearly postulates in that teaching, which you find in the 7th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, verses 13 and 14, which is quite relevant to our line of thinking and sharing. So, in order to understand how covetousness or greed or worldly desires and obsessions with worldly acquisitions, worldly gains, hinders our spiritual growth. Let's take just two examples from the New Testament. In the 12th chapter of Luke's Gospel, we find Jesus exhorting the people regarding very important spiritual insights, spiritual realities. There's a man in the crowd which is standing and listening to him. As far as he is concerned, he is not paying any heed to what Jesus is saying. His mind is obsessed with, filled with the desire for property. He was in a dispute with his brother regarding how the ancestral property was to be divided. And you know that disputes develop because of covetousness. The brotherly affection gets ruined, into enmity because of covetousness. So the disruptive, the ruinous aspect of covetousness is clearly embedded here. So he wants Jesus' intervention to tilt the balance in his favor. Therefore, he says, "Command my brother to divide the property between us." So whatever Jesus says doesn't matter to him. His only intention is to make Jesus is to use Jesus as a tool to subserve his material interests. This is by and large the attitude of most Christians who seem to be very pious, very godly. The end result or the ultimate aim of their piety is to use Jesus as a tool to realize their exaggerated dreams and desires. So Jesus must become the means by which their covetousness is fulfilled. And Jesus makes it very clear that he has nothing to do with it, though 2000 years of proclamation has not dispelled this serious aberration. Rather, that aberration is intensifying day by day. And today, of course, it has assumed this nightmarish prospect of the prosperity gospel, which is the prosperity devilish gospel. Devilish bad news, not gospel, devilish bad news. Let's consider another example. Among the 12 disciples, there was one Judas Iscariot. Why do you think Judas sold his master? It's nothing but covetousness. In his mind, 30 pieces of silver are more desirable than his master. When you sell something, you sell because you consider that to be a very advantageous transaction. You wouldn't sell something in order to incur a loss. So when he weighed Jesus and 30 pieces of silver on the balance of his covetous mind, 30 pieces of silver seemed far more attractive. So the message here is very simple but sinister. If there is covetousness, desires, or greed within us, if our nature is driven by greed or desire or covetousness, we will sell God at any price that seems desirable to us. And unfortunately, the last 2000 years, Jesus has been reduced to a commodity that's on sale in the markets of Christian religiosity. It's an extremely regrettable state. And prosperity gospel and the kind of um, tremendous popularity it has achieved in such a short span of time is the climax, as we have seen so far, of this very unfortunate, most regrettable practice of selling Jesus in the market of human covetous religiosity. So I think it's now fairly clear that unless and until, as Jesus himself said very clearly, we overcome this problem of covetousness, of greed, which is what rides our self. Selfishness. What is selfishness? Selfishness is nothing but how we are disposed when we are greedy or covetous, when we are driven by our own desires. When we are driven by our own desires, we will not be able to see the neighbor. And therefore, the teaching that you must love your neighbor as yourself, which actually means the same thing that the last of the commandments prescribe, that you shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. So, love your neighbor as yourself means in your relationship with your neighbor, make sure that covetousness or greed does not find a place. Because the moment covetousness or greed infiltrates your relationship with your neighbor, it will definitely degenerate into enmity. For example, the boundary dispute between neighbors. In olden days that I have seen myself, people will shift their boundary a little bit, encroaching into the property, the land of the neighbor by a little bit, and then keep shifting little bit, little by little. Then a fairly substantial parcel of the land is swallowed up. Why do you do that to your neighbor? Because of covetousness. So the moment covetousness comes into your relationship with your neighbor, this happens. And that happens in every context. Now, covetousness in the passional sense of the term results in rape. What is it that motivates all sex related crimes? It is carnal covetousness. So, greed or covetousness has multiple expressions, and in every one of those expressions, it proves to be an utter disaster for our spiritual life. So, that is why covetousness or desire or greed is clearly identified, not only in Christianity, but in every religious thinking that I'm aware of, as the foremost danger to human spiritual development and welfare. Hence, the need to overcome covetousness or desires or greed. Now, what are we to do about it? All right, we have discovered that there is a huge problem. Then something must be done about the problem. Now, Jesus does not lay down uh, clearly spelled directions as to how greed is to be overcome, though there is sufficient material in the teachings of Jesus Christ scattered here and there, which, if you piece together, you will arrive at a proper understanding as to how we are to go about this basic spiritual task of overcoming our greed or this spiritual weakness of being covetous. Now, in order to attain some clarity regarding this most crucial issue, I would like to take all of you to the thinking on the subject in Hindu philosophy. Now, I know that traditional Christians would be a little startled if I try to include insights from Hindu philosophy in Christian, and that to Sunday morning meditations. But I have to tell you very clearly that this is nothing but a prejudice which is created by a narrow mindedness. As I've said in many of my previous videos, one of the necessary attributes of Jesus Christ in his spiritual vision is universality. Universality means including everything. Universality is necessarily inclusive. Nothing can be excluded if your outlook is universal. And that's the idea of being ecumenical. Or ecumene is the whole world as a family, which is a vision found in Hindu philosophy. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the whole Vasudha, the whole of the created order as your family. And therefore, if you're spiritual, then you have to be a world citizen. You cannot be parochial. Parochialism and godliness cannot coexist, though all churches promote parochialism, parochial loyalty to the church as the foremost spiritual duty of every Christian. And it is a serious aberration. And this is one of the many reasons why the Christian community is so horribly fragmented. And in spite of the fact that Jesus' passionate priority was to preserve the unity of believers, Christians on their own have chopped up, made a mincemeat to the body of Jesus Christ in thousands and thousands of churches because of their ability to promote sectarian passions and loyalties in the name of Jesus Christ himself. So Christians are saying, well, it's for your sake, Jesus, that we make a mincemeat of you. I leave it to you to measure the merit of the standpoint. All right. Now, what does Hindu philosophy say? Like in the case of Jesus' teaching, Hindu spiritual philosophy, which is highly developed, and Christians pronounce or Christians make pronouncements on Hindu philosophy without knowing ABCD about it, which is highly regrettable. I don't claim to be an expert on Hinduism. I know very, very, very little about it, but such the little that I know makes me realize that there is a great deal in Hindu philosophy which can be used to understand many things in the Bible in a better light. And this task must begin to attain greater clarity regarding the faith that we think we know and love. Now, in Hindu philosophy, desire is recognized as a serious problem, and therefore, what are we to do about it? Hindu philosophy says renounce. renounce. And the word for renunciation, Sanskrit word, of course, is vairagya. Vairagya. Now, the self denial that Jesus prescribes is quite the same as the vairagya that the Hindu philosophy lays down. What does vairagya mean? Vairagya means renunciation. What is it that we have to renounce? We have to renounce our desires. So, exactly the same thing. I find absolutely no difference between the two. But the difference is this, that in Hindu philosophy, there is far greater subtlety and gradation in understanding Vairagya and how it is practiced, or with what purpose these four stages of Vairagya are to be practiced. Therefore, I propose to now go ahead and introduce very briefly to you these four grades of Vairagya. The first is Mridula Vairagya. Now, as the title clearly says, it is the softest version of Vairagya or renunciation. And at this stage, there are four stages. This is the first stage. In the first stage of practicing and growing in the discipline of renunciation, the first is that you realize that earthly pleasures, though they appear to be attractive, seductive, are actually worthless, even repulsive. So, in the first stage, the seductiveness of worldly attractions are reduced. At this stage, there is really no desire, or there is no impulsion from within to attain higher stages of spiritual interest. It is purely this negative state of realizing that worldly pleasures are not as attractive as they seem to be, rather, they're a liability. So that is Mridula Vairagya. The second stage is Madhyama Vairagya. So it's kind of middle kind of state. And in this state, besides or in addition to realizing that worldly pleasures are not desirable, there's also the kind of incipient realization or embryonic realization or seminal realization that there are higher delights which are godly, which are spiritual, they are noble, and in the long run, they alone are real. But all these earthly pleasures are illusory, they are of transitory value, and they will ruin you as much as they please you in the present. And the pleasures they induce are short lived and they're also poisonous. And these pleasures are therefore eating you up. They are like canker within a bud. They will do serious harm to your personality. Then, in the second stage of Madhyama Vairagya, you proceed towards this reorientation from earthly pleasures to divine interest, joyous interest, but you are not really moving in that direction. A reorientation has taken place. It's like a birth of a new baby. It's time, it's about the time the baby is born. But the baby has not really seen the light of the world, but it is very much there. In the third stage, and that third stage is called Adimatra Vairagya. Adimatra Vairagya. In the third stage, this new baby is born. So a new desire takes the place of the old desire, or a new delight, not desire, a new delight takes the place of the old desire, which is delight in things godly, light. So, in terms of Hindu symbolism, in terms of the prayer, there is a reorientation from darkness to light. From darkness to light. So, in the third stage of Adimatra Vairagya, the human nature is turned from the desire, which is the world of darkness, to the world of light, which is the divine interest. The fourth stage is a final stage where It's not only that there is this orientation which is now consolidated, but that, or on account of that, worldly desires are completely renounced. They are seen as evil. And that stage, the final stage, is called para vairagya. Para in Sanskrit is a root which means the ultimate beyond which there is no further stage. So para vairagya. Now, four stages, let's recollect. Mridula vairagya, madhyama vairagya, adimatra vairagya, and para vairagya. Four stages. Now, why I'm sharing this with you, even though I'm ignorant and I'm at best a novice as far as Hindu spiritual philosophy is concerned, which I have to say is very profound, very profound, very profound. And I would advise my fellow Christians, if they're interested in understanding spiritual things clearly, at least certain issues, a little bit of work in the field of Hindu spiritual philosophy will stand us in very good stead. So, when you reach that Paravairagya stage, and I think Jesus, when he says the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, that is his own choice. It is not that he could not have. He could have had anything that he wanted. After all, you remember when Jesus was tempted by Satan, he was offered the entire world on a platter. So it was a deliberate choice to be in the state of Paravairagya, where there is a state of complete renunciation and feeling happy about it and realizing that it's a source of empowerment and not a state of deprivation. So, if only from that state could Jesus have said, the foxes have their holes, the birds in there have their nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And he's not saying that in a self pitying tone, he's saying that as an affirmation. And I'm sure there's a higher stage of renunciation. And without attaining that highest, the ultimate state of self renunciation, Jesus could not have said, I and my Father are one. Jesus could not have said in the Garden of Gethsemane, even as he was sweating blood, not my will, but thine be done. Without attaining this highest state of self renunciation, Jesus could not have offered himself as an atonement for the sins of the world. So, if you want to understand the meaning of the cross, this state of para vairagya, I repeat, para vairagya, P-A-R-A, para vairagya, V-I-R-A-G-Y-A, vairagya, is very, very helpful. And that is the ultimate state envisaged in Hindu philosophy. So, now, in the light of what we have seen so far, look at prosperity gospel. You will recognize that it is a complete, most obscene contradiction of all that Jesus stood for. Jesus stood for the complete evolution of the spiritual potential within us. You take any teaching by Jesus, perhaps the most familiar one is Matthew chapter 5, verses 14, 15, 16, where Jesus says that there is light within you, but that light is covered under a bushel. That is a state of being dominated by worldly desires. What does it mean to remove the bushel so that the light shines and it gives light to all in the house and all around you? It is a state of overcoming your desires, a state of attaining perfect renunciation or para vairagya. And it was because Jesus was in a state of para vairagya that he could interact with the woman of Samaria beside Jacob's well, Jacob's well, and not really corrupt her further. The 6 men who met her at the same well before Jesus met used her and degraded her because they were men of desires. They were all ambassadors of worldly desires. Therefore, when they saw this woman, they only saw her as an instrument of sexual self indulgence. And that's the tragedy of women in this country. And women don't realize that it's not that men are their enemies, it is that the world, the culture in which men and women both are living are dominated by desires. And that domination reduces human nature to animal nature. Therefore, you must expect men to behave like animals. And in one sense, they are to be pitied because they were not trained better. Nobody has given them a better understanding. Rather, everything that they have seen and experienced, everything that they have been exposed to from birth onwards, induced into them this feeling that the best they can do for themselves is to indulge in their desires to the utmost. And that's what they're doing. So it is a culture. The culture that we have so proudly built up is a culture that induces sexual madness in men. And therefore, the consequence also is real and is there for all to see. And the real consequence of overcoming desires, real consequence of practicing the discipline of vairagya and attaining the state of spiritual evolution is that one becomes a means for enhancing, enriching, increasing the value of anyone and everyone, male or female, young or old, even dead body that comes into contact with you. That's the meaning of spirituality. And when Jesus says that you are the light of the world, what he really means is you must attain this kind of personality by which wherever you are, you're able to impart something positive, something beautiful, something good, something rich, something worthwhile to others. We must pray for ourselves only to this extent that, only to the extent, Lord, make me the kind of person who can be a source of enrichment according to the given context in the life of others. That's the only prayer that we need to make. No other prayer is actually required. But to the extent that we are dominated by this insanity of prosperity gospel, which is a gospel which substitutes God with greed. Greed is God. Now, today, globally, the global system, in the wake of the rise of globalization, liberalization, etc., everybody agrees that we have enshrined greed as God. So that has happened in the realm of economics, politics, etc. So correspondingly, in the realm of religion, prosperity gospel has arisen, which also says greed is God. But the only difference is that here, greed is God. The creed that greed is God is given a spiritual color, whereas in the secular world, the creed that greed is God is not given a religious color. Therefore, the secular world today is more honest than the religious world. That's a great pity. That's a condemnation. Unfortunately, Christians do not have, people in general do not have the intellectual, spiritual discernment to understand this terrible tragedy that's happening to us. With all the deleterious consequences, the manifold religious consequences, unfortunate, destructive, self corrupting consequences that are coming to light in their thousands. We overlook all the sinister evidence and make a beeline to be fooled by the merchants of the prosperity gospel. And I sincerely hope that the clarity of understanding offered through this video would make a difference. And to that extent, I would also request you to be partners with me in spreading this light. Therefore, please share the link of this video with all you can, no matter who that person is. Let people think. Let more and more light come in. That's how the Bible begins. Let there be light. That's all I have to say. Let there be light. People are fooled in their thousands because they are in darkness. And in such a context, the highest, greatest, noblest contribution we can make is to make light prevail. Therefore, I end by repeating the three words, the all important three words. Forward. Let there be light. Let there be light. Forwards. Let there be light. All the best. Thank you.